The fluorescent hum of the bank branch did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within Arthur Hayes's bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the thermostat, and everything to do with the gnawing anxiety that clung to him like a second skin. It was late afternoon, the waning light outside casting long, indifferent shadows across the polished linoleum, mirroring the lengthening shadows in his own life. He stood a solitary figure among the sparse clientele, his shoulders hunched not from the weight of a physical burden, but from the invisible, unceasing pressure of being solely responsible for two small, hungry, and impossibly hopeful children. His gaze drifted aimlessly across the array of glossy brochures promising financial security, home loans, and savings plans, distant and unattainable dreams that felt like cruel taunts in his current predicament. He clutched a worn envelope in his hand, its edges soft from repeated handling, containing a slip of paper that was, at once, his last resort and a symbol of a humiliating, trivial inadequacy. This wasn't his usual bank. His account, meager as it was, resided across town, a detail he was acutely aware of as he shifted his weight, feeling the uncomfortable tightness in his chest. But the check in his hand, a seemingly insignificant scrap, was drawn on this particular institution, a small local credit union branch that felt both quaint and intimidating. Every breath he took felt shallow, strained. He was a man accustomed to hard labor, to the ache of muscles after a double shift. But this kind of internal strain, this silent battle against despair, was far more debilitating. The weight of his children's innocent needs, their unwavering faith in him, pressed down, making the simple act of cashing a check feel like an insurmountable task. He'd tried to ignore the check for days, stuffing it into the back of a drawer, hoping some other miracle might materialize. But miracles, he had learned, were in short supply, and desperation, a tireless companion, had finally pushed him through these unfamiliar doors. Arthur Hayes was a man etched by life, not sculpted. His once vibrant auburn hair was now liberally streaked with gray at the temples, despite being only in his early 30s. His eyes, a startling blue, held a perpetual weariness that no amount of sleep seemed to alleviate. But beneath the fatigue, a stubborn spark of resilience still flickered. His hands, say calloused and rough from years of manual labor, construction, landscaping, anything that paid, trembled almost imperceptibly as he gripped the envelope. He wore a faded flannel shirt, its colors muted by countless washes, and jeans that had seen better days, testament to a life lived on the fringes of financial comfort. Every frayed seam, every slight tear, told a silent story of struggle, of stretching every dollar until it screamed. He wasn't a man given to dramatics, but the confluence of recent events had pushed him to a precipice he hadn't known existed. His last construction gig had dried up unexpectedly, leaving him scrambling, and a series of minor household emergencies had devoured what little savings he'd managed to squirrel away. He had exhausted his options, depleted his pride, and now, here he was, reduced to this. His turn finally arrived, announced by a soft chime, and the vacant stare of a young teller behind the counter. "Next in line, please," she said, her voice devoid of inflection, a robotic pronouncement. Arthur approached, his steps heavy, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, although the branch was practically empty. He placed the envelope on the cool, sterile counter, his fingers lingering on it for a moment, as if to imbue it with some forgotten strength. The teller, a young woman barely out of her teens, with perfectly coiffed hair and an unsettlingly pristine uniform, offered a polite but distant smile. "How may I help you today?" she inquired, her gaze already drifting past him to the next potential customer. "I'd like to cash this check, please," Arthur said, his voice a little hoarse, betraying the dryness in his throat. He pushed the check forward, careful not to wrinkle it further, as if its physical integrity somehow influenced its validity. It was small, almost offensively so. A paltry sum, a mere fragment of what he truly needed. Yet for him, it represented the immediate difference between his children eating a warm meal tonight or going to bed with rumbling stomachs. It was the cost of a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, perhaps even a small, inexpensive toy to momentarily brighten their shadowed days. He hated the indignity of it, the feeling of asking for so little, yet needing it so profoundly. The teller picked up the check, her manicured fingers brushing against the paper. Her name tag read Chloe. She glanced at the amount, then at the signature, and then back at the amount again. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hesitation, no, a fleeting twitch at the corner of her lips that Arthur, in his hyper-alert state, immediately noticed. It wasn't a look of suspicion, not exactly, but something akin to mild bewilderment, perhaps even a touch of amusement, as if the sum itself were a joke. He braced himself, his jaw tightening. Was she judging him? Was the amount so laughably small that it was an affront to their opulent marble halls? He felt a flush creep up his neck. "All right, sir," Chloe said, her voice now slightly softer, less detached, a hint of something unreadable in her tone. She slid the check into the scanner, the mechanical whirring sound filling the momentary silence. Arthur watched, every nerve ending taut. This was it, the mundane act of a transaction that held his entire world in precarious balance. He imagined little Lily's face, her bright, more innocent eyes asking for a story before bed. He pictured young Thomas, always hungry, always looking for a snack. Their faces, superimposed over the glowing screen of the teller's monitor, amplified the desperation that clawed at him. The scanner finished its job, and Chloe's eyes fixed on her screen. Her brow furrowed slightly. She tapped a few keys, then paused. Her gaze flickered back to the physical check, then to the screen, a repetitive dance. The initial mild bewilderment seemed to deepen, giving way to a more pronounced confusion. Arthur's heart began to thud, a heavy, discordant drum in his chest. What was wrong? Was there an issue with the account? Had the person who wrote it somehow made a mistake? His mind raced, cataloging every possible disaster scenario. He knew the check was legitimate, as it had come from a distant relative, a great aunt he hadn't seen in years, an almost forgotten gesture of kindness after she'd heard of his wife's passing and his subsequent struggles. A relative he vaguely remembered his mother mentioning, a kind woman known for sending small, thoughtful gifts. But the relative was notoriously eccentric, and this tiny amount felt odd. Chloe cleared her throat, her voice now a whisper, almost apologetic. "Sir, I need to call my manager for this." The words hung in the air, cold and definitive, like a door slamming shut on his faint hope. Arthur felt a surge of panic, hot and electrifying. "What? Why?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Is there a problem? Is the check not good?" He felt a flush of shame, imagining the bank holding him responsible for some error beyond his control. The teller avoided his gaze, her focus fixed on the check as if it might spontaneously combust. "It's not a matter of insufficient funds, sir," she clarified, a little too quickly, as if to preempt his deepest fear. "It's just a unique situation. I haven't seen anything quite like this before in the system. Our protocol dictates I get a manager involved for anything unusual." Unusual. The word echoed in Arthur's mind, amplifying his anxiety. What could possibly be unusual about a check for $27.32? It wasn't $1 million. It wasn't a complex corporate transfer. It was a paltry sum, so small that it felt like an insult. Yet now it was causing a commotion. His desperation warred with a rising tide of indignation. He just wanted his money, his children's dinner, his small victory against the encroaching darkness. He watched as Chloe rose from her seat and walked briskly towards a glass-walled office at the back of the branch, her pristine uniform a stark contrast to his own worn clothes. He felt every eye in the sparse bank, a young couple filling out loan applications, an elderly woman balancing her checkbook, suddenly on him, judging him, though they likely weren't. The paranoia was a familiar companion these days. A moment later, a woman emerged from the office. She was older than Chloe, with an air of composed authority. Her dark hair was styled impeccably, and her business suit was tailored to perfection. Her gaze, sharp and intelligent, swept across the bank floor before settling on Arthur. He knew instinctively that this was the manager. She moved with a purpose, her high heels clicking softly on the polished floor, a sound that seemed to amplify the tension in the quiet branch. Her name tag identified her as Ms. Albright, She approached the counter, Chloe trailing nervously behind her, offering hushed explanations. Ms. Albright listened, her expression unreadable, then nodded, her eyes never leaving Arthur. He felt himself shrinking under her scrutiny. "Mr. Hayes?" she inquired, her voice calm, professional, yet with an underlying firmness that bespoke years of dealing with various banking scenarios, both mundane and complex. "Yes, that's me," Arthur replied, his voice a little stronger this time, a flicker of his inherent stubbornness asserting itself. "Is there a problem with the check?" Ms. Albright offered a polite, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let me just take a look at it, sir." She took the check from Chloe's hand, her fingers slender and well manicured, a stark contrast to Arthur's own rough digits. She held it up to the light, turning it over, examining both sides with a meticulousness that sent another jolt of unease through Arthur. He had signed the back himself, per instructions, but he hadn't scrutinized the front beyond the amount and the name of the payee. To him, it was just a piece of paper representing a tiny, critical sum. To her, it seemed to be an artifact under intense examination. His mind flashed back to the morning, to Lily asking for cereal, and him having to explain that they only had enough for one small bowl for her and Thomas. The pang of guilt, the burning shame. He needed this money, desperately. He thought of the half-empty refrigerator at home, the dwindling supply of diapers for Lily, the gas gauge dangerously close to empty. Every second that passed, every careful movement of Ms. Albright's fingers felt like an eternity, stretching the fragile thread of his patience to breaking point. He wanted to shout, to explain his plight, to demand they just give him his $27.32 so he could leave and resume his silent battle for survival. But his pride, battered and bruised as it was, held his tongue. Ms. Albright's gaze remained fixed on the check. Her expression, initially composed, began to subtly shift. Her brow furrowed, a faint line appearing between her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. She brought the check closer to her face, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher a hidden code. The professional detachment she had maintained moments before began to crack, replaced by an expression Arthur couldn't quite place. Curiosity, perhaps, mingled with something else, something deeper and more profound. He watched her every nuance, his heart now thudding with a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The air in the bank seemed to thicken, the fluorescent hum suddenly oppressive. Even Chloe, standing dutifully beside her manager, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, her youthful confidence replaced by a nervous fidgeting. Ms. Albright's lips parted slightly, a soft, almost inaudible gasp escaping her. Her eyes, which had been sharply focused, now widened, growing round with an emotion Arthur couldn't fathom. A tremor ran through her hand, the one holding the check, causing the flimsy paper to ripple almost imperceptibly. Her breath hitched, a soft, catching sound that was amplified in the sudden, profound silence that had fallen over the counter. The professional mask she wore so effortlessly shattered, revealing a raw, unadulterated shock. Her face, which had been a picture of calm competence, drained of all color, turning a startling, ghostly white. Her body went utterly rigid, frozen in the act of holding the check. Her eyes were no longer focused on the tiny numerical amount, but seemed to stare through it at something beyond, at some distant, startling revelation. The check for $27.32 had utterly immobilized her. Arthur stared, his own jaw slack, a cold dread washing over him. The suddenness of her reaction was terrifying. It wasn't confusion or mild surprise or even suspicion. It was a complete, visceral freeze, as if she had just seen a ghost. The small amount, the check itself, suddenly seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, charged with a meaning he couldn't comprehend. What was it? What secret did that innocuous slip of paper hold? And what would it mean for Arthur and his desperate fight for his family? What could possibly make a bank manager, a woman of evident composure and experience, freeze at the sight of such a small sum? His mind raced, grasping for explanations, but found only void. The world had stopped, and he was left in its terrifying, silent epicenter. The air in the otherwise bustling bank lobby, a hum of muted conversations and the rhythmic whir of ATM machines, suddenly seemed to thicken around Michael. It wasn't a tangible change, but a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a quiet dread that settled like an unseen fog. His heart, which had been beating a hopeful cadence just moments before, now thrummed with a nervous energy against his ribs, a frantic little drum solo of apprehension. The bank manager, a woman whose name he hadn't even registered amidst the swirling anxieties of his day, remained utterly motionless, her gaze fixed on the small, crisp piece of paper he had handed her. Her posture, initially one of efficient professionalism, had rigidified into an almost sculptural stillness. Her eyes, which had been scanning the check's details with practiced speed, now seemed to stare through it into some unseen abyss beyond the polished counter. Michael watched, his brow furrowing, as a faint, almost imperceptible pallor spread across her complexion, leaching the color from her cheeks and leaving them a shade reminiscent of old parchment. The neatly arranged strands of hair around her temples, previously immaculate, now seemed to frame a face that had aged years in a mere breath. A bead of sweat, tiny and glistening, had materialized just above her upper lip, testament to some unseen internal exertion. This was not the typical, fleeting pause of a busy professional. This was a complete, jarring suspension of being. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Michael finally managed, his voice sounding oddly small and reedy in the sudden, cavernous silence that felt like it had descended specifically upon their interaction. He tried to inject a note of casualness into his tone to cut through the bizarre tableau, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate. The manager did not respond. Her lips, pressed together thinly, showed no sign of movement. Her chest did not visibly rise or fall. For a terrifying fraction of a second, Michael wondered if she had simply stopped, like a machine that had suddenly seized up mid-operation. His mind, already a battlefield of worries, began to race down unfamiliar paths. Was this some new bank policy? A delay tactic? Had he somehow inadvertently presented a fraudulent check without knowing it? The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through him. He recalled the painstaking effort it had taken to even acquire this modest sum. It was not much, a meager amount that under normal circumstances he wouldn't even think twice about. But for Michael, for his life, for the small, precious world he was desperately trying to keep afloat, it was everything. He thought of Leo, his youngest, with his bright, questioning eyes and his endless curiosity, who had been asking for a new set of crayons, specifically the ones with the glitter, and Maya, his eldest, navigating the treacherous waters of middle school, whose old sneakers were practically falling apart at the seams, a source of quiet embarrassment he keenly felt, a wound to his paternal pride. This check, this insignificant slip of paper, was supposed to bridge the gap, to quiet the immediate needs, to buy them a little more time, a sliver of comfort, in a world that often felt relentlessly unforgiving. It was a lifeline, not a fortune. Certainly not something that should trigger such an alarming, catatonic reaction from a seasoned bank manager. The small odd job he had taken, a few grueling hours of hauling heavy boxes in a warehouse on the outskirts of town, had felt like a godsend. Now the client, a gruff but fair man named Frank, had paid him with this very check, an impersonal slip of paper that nevertheless represented a direct exchange for his sweat and aching muscles. Michael had folded it carefully into his worn wallet, the crinkle of the paper a small, comforting sound of promise. He had planned to go straight to the grocery store after this, to pick up the ingredients for Leo's favorite mac and cheese, maybe even splurge on a small toy for Maya, a token to show her he noticed, he cared, he was trying. All those hopes, those small, vital plans, now hung precariously in the balance, suspended in the unsettling silence of the bank. A nervous cough escaped his throat, dry and rasping. The manager remained unmoving. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, on the cheap soles of his sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished linoleum floor, the sound amplified in the strange pocket of quiet that had formed around them. Other customers, oblivious in their own transactions, moved around them like silent, distant figures in a dream. He wondered if anyone else noticed the manager's unnatural stillness, or if he was simply overreacting, his sleep-deprived mind conjuring drama where there was none. But the cold knot in his stomach told him otherwise. This was far from normal. He tried to meet her eyes to find some flicker of recognition, some indication that she was still present, still capable of human interaction. But her gaze was unwavering, fixed. It was the stare of someone who had just witnessed something profoundly shocking, but something that had fundamentally altered their perception of reality. It was a look he had only seen in movies, never imagined he would encounter in the mundane setting of a bank on a Tuesday morning. The casual chatter that had filled the air moments ago now seemed to recede further, replaced by the insistent thumping of his own pulse in his ears. The manager's hand, still clutching the check, was surprisingly steady, but Michael noticed a subtle tremor in her wrist, a barely perceptible vibration that hinted at the immense internal pressure she was under. Her knuckles, white against her skin, suggested a grip that was tighter than necessary, as if the check itself were a fragile, dangerous artifact she was afraid to drop. What could possibly be written on a check? A simple financial instrument that could elicit such a visceral and a profound reaction? It wasn't the number itself. He was sure of that. The amount was so inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, a trivial sum that wouldn't even raise an eyebrow for most. It had to be something else. The sender? The account? The very nature of the transaction? His mind, desperate for an answer, spun in frustrating circles. He considered reaching out, gently tapping her arm, but something in her unyielding stillness warned him against it. It was as if she were perched on the edge of a precipice, and the slightest nudge might send her tumbling into an abyss he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He felt a wave of helplessness wash over him, a familiar and unwelcome sensation that had become a constant companion since his wife passed. He was always fighting, always scrambling, always just one step away from losing control, and now, even this small, hard-won victory was being snatched away by an inexplicable, silent tableau. The ticking of the large wall clock behind the teller counter became oppressively loud, each second stretching into an eternity. He thought of the other times he had felt this kind of suspended animation, this agonizing wait for an outcome he couldn't control. Waiting by his wife's hospital bed, waiting for a call back from a potential employer, waiting for Leo's fever to break. Each moment was a battle against his own spiraling thoughts, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of calm. But this was different. This wasn't about a natural disaster or a personal tragedy. This was a small, everyday transaction that had inexplicably veered into the realm of the surreal. Sorry, he cleared his throat again, louder this time. "Excuse me, ma'am, is there a problem with the check?" His voice wavered slightly, betraying the growing desperation he felt. He had to know. He couldn't just stand there, suspended in this bizarre, silent drama. He needed answers. He needed that money. He needed to move forward. His life didn't afford him the luxury of waiting in polite, confused silence. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the manager's eyes detached themselves from the check. They drifted upwards, first to his chest, then his chin, and finally they met his own. But it wasn't the gaze he expected. There was no professional courtesy, no polite apology for the delay. Instead, her eyes, wide and strangely luminous, held a complex tapestry of emotions. A stark, unadulterated shock, a flicker of something akin to fear, and beneath it all, a deep, unsettling pity. It was the look of someone who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps seen a future that was profoundly troubling. Her lips parted, just barely, as if to speak, but no sound emerged. She swallowed audibly, a dry, grating sound that broke the oppressive silence for a brief moment. Her gaze then flickered back down to the check, as if seeking confirmation of the terrible truth she had just uncovered. Her grip tightened further, the fragile paper threatening to crinkle under the pressure. Michael could see the specific digits of the check number, the routing number, the account number, all printed so neatly. He could even glimpse a small corner of the signature. But none of it meant anything to him. It was just a check. Yet to her, it was a revelation, a harbinger of something significant and unsettling. He felt an icy wave wash over him, a chilling premonition that whatever she had seen, whatever she now knew, was not good. It was not a simple clerical error or a minor technicality. This was something far, far bigger. He wished he could snatch the check back, crumple it, erase this whole bizarre encounter. But it was too late. The information, whatever it was, had been absorbed, processed, and had irrevocably altered the manager's world and, by extension, his own. He was caught in a current he hadn't seen, pulled into a situation he couldn't possibly have anticipated. The mundane act of cashing a small check, a task he had performed countless times without incident, had become a pivotal, terrifying moment. He braced himself instinctively for whatever revelation was about to come, for the words that would finally break her silence and unravel the fragile normalcy of his day. But the words still wouldn't come. Only that harrowing, knowing gaze. The air in the bank manager's office thickened, heavy and unmoving, a sudden unnatural stillness descending upon the previously bustling room. Michael, still clutching the worn strap of his faded messenger bag, watched, mesmerized and increasingly bewildered, as Mrs. Albright remained utterly rigid, the small, unassuming check held between her forefinger and thumb as if it were a fragile artifact from another epoch. Her eyes, which moments before had held the crisp, professional glint of a seasoned financial executive, were now wide, unblinking, and fixed on some distant, unseen point beyond the pristine office wall. The color had drained from her face with a speed that startled Michael, leaving her complexion a sallow, almost sickly white. Her lips parted slightly, revealing a flash of perfectly aligned teeth, but no sound, no breath escaped them. It was as if she had been abruptly, irrevocably frozen in time, a living statue carved from fear or profound shock. Michael's initial flicker of impatience, a low thrum of annoyance at the unexpected delay, swiftly morphed into a deeper, more unsettling concern. He cleared his throat gently, a small, polite cough designed to break the spell, to nudge her back into the present. "Mrs. Albright," he ventured, his voice a tentative ripple in the suddenly profound silence. "Is everything all right?" No response. Her gaze remained locked, unseeing, on the wall behind him. The hand holding the check was steady, say almost unnervingly so, yet something about its absolute stillness suggested not calm, but a paralysis so complete it bordered on catatonia. He watched, fascinated and repulsed, as a faint tremor began to register, first in her fingertips, then spreading slowly up her arm, a subtle vibration that hinted at a massive internal struggle. The small check, so utterly mundane in its appearance, now seemed to possess a malevolent power, a hidden weight that had crushed the manager's composure instantly. Michael's mind, accustomed to the immediate, tangible problems of leaky faucets and overdue bills, struggled to comprehend the surreal tableau before him. What could possibly be on that check? He'd seen the amount. A pittance, really, just enough to cover a week's worth of groceries and perhaps a partial payment on the electricity bill. It was a sum that, in the grand scheme of the bank's daily transactions, should barely register as a blip. Yet, Mrs. Albright's reaction was not one of mild surprise or professional curiosity. It was primal, visceral, an almost elemental fear that seemed to emanate from her in palpable waves, chilling the air around them. He glanced around the perfectly appointed office, its veneer of corporate tranquility now seeming like a thin, fragile mask. The framed diplomas on the wall, the polished mahogany desk, the potted fern in the corner, all mocked the bizarre scene unfolding. Through the glass partition, he could see the rhythmic hum of the main bank floor. Tellers efficiently counting cash, customers patiently waiting, the distant clatter of a coin machine. It was a world of order and predictability, utterly divorced from the silent, so unsettling drama, playing out mere feet away. This jarring contrast only amplified Michael's growing sense of unease. He felt suddenly conspicuous, caught in an invisible trap, the sole audience to a performance he didn't understand, and desperately wanted to escape. A full minute, perhaps more, crawled by, each second stretching into an eternity. Michael shifted his weight, his leg beginning to ache. He wanted to reach out, to wave a hand in front of her face, to shout, to do something to break this suffocating stasis, but a strange, almost superstitious fear held him back. He didn't want to startle her, didn't want to provoke whatever deep-seated terror had seized her. What if she screamed? What if she collapsed? The sheer improbability of the situation made every potential next step feel fraught with unseen peril. Finally, with a sound like a small, choked gasp, Mrs. Albright stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly lowered, only to snap open again. Her gaze no longer fixed on the wall, but now, unnervingly, directly on Michael. Her eyes, still wide, were clouded with a complex mixture of fear, disbelief, and something akin to accusation. She wasn't looking at him, Michael realized with a jolt. She was looking through him, at something far more profound and disturbing. Her hand, which had held the check so rigidly, now began to tremble violently. The small paper rectangle vibrated, a faint rustle accompanying the movement. Then, with agonizing slowness, she lowered her arm, the check still clutched, but her focus remained on Michael. Her lips moved, forming words that seemed to struggle for release, caught in her constricted throat. "Sir," she finally rasped, her voice thin and reedy, utterly devoid of its earlier professionalism. It was a sound that sent a shiver down Michael's spine, a sound of profound distress. "Sir, where, where did you get this?" The question, when it finally came, was so unexpected, so far removed from the simple act of cashing a check, that Michael was momentarily stunned into silence himself. He blinked, trying to process the shift from catatonic shock to this desperate, almost pleading interrogation. His mind, still grappling with the bizarre unfolding events, struggled to offer a coherent answer. It's from Mr. Henderson," Michael stammered, feeling a flush of defensive confusion creep up his neck. "Old Mr. Henderson, down the street, from the yard work I did for him last week. Weeding, mowing, now trimming those hedges." He gestured vaguely, his hand sweeping across an imaginary lawn. He felt an irrational need to justify the small sum, to prove its legitimacy, even though the amount was so insignificant. "He's always been good for it. A bit slow sometimes, but always pays up." Mrs. Albright didn't seem to hear his explanation of Mr. Henderson's reliability or the mundane nature of the work. Her gaze had intensified, drilling into him, seeking something beyond his words. Her face, still pale, seemed to contort slightly as if she were trying to reconcile what she saw with some terrible knowledge she now possessed. She slowly, deliberately, placed the check face down on her desk, as if it were too dangerous to look at, too volatile to expose. But her hand remained splayed over it, a possessive, protective gesture, as if to shield it from unseen eyes or perhaps to prevent it from vanishing. "Mr. Henderson," she repeated, the name a whisper, a question, an echo of disbelief. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, a single sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. When her eyes reopened, they were no longer glazed with fear, but sharpened with an urgent, almost desperate resolve. "And did he give it to you personally? Did you speak with him?" Michael felt a prickle of annoyance mixed with his deepening confusion. This was absurd. He was a struggling single dad, trying to cash a check for $55, not a suspect in some convoluted financial crime. "Of course I spoke with him, Mrs. Albright," he said, his voice firmer now, a thread of weariness entering it. "He called me on Tuesday, asked if I could help him out. His back's been acting up, you know. We chatted for a bit while I was working. He wrote the check for me right there on his porch when I finished up on Friday afternoon. Said to have a good weekend." Why? What in the world is going on? He pushed back in his chair slightly, his posture shifting from polite patience to guarded apprehension. The sheer oddity of the situation was starting to gnaw at his already frayed nerves. His daughter, Lily, would be home from school in just a few hours. He had promised her the special, albeit cheap, ice cream from the corner store if he managed to get the groceries. The thought of disappointing her, of failing to provide even this small pleasure, fueled a quiet desperation that now clashed violently with the manager's increasingly bizarre behavior. This $55 wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline, however thin. Mrs. Lane Albright ignored his rising frustration. Her hand, still resting on the inverted check, now began to press down with surprising force. Her eyes darted from Michael's face to the closed door of her office, then to the opaque glass of the partition, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Her demeanor had subtly but profoundly shifted from passive shock to active, almost conspiratorial alarm. "Mr. Michael," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense murmur, forcing him to lean forward to catch her words. "Are you absolutely certain that Mr. Henderson handed this to you personally?" She emphasized the word personally with a chilling intensity, as if the entire fabric of reality hinged on that single detail. "You saw him, you spoke to him, he was alive and well?" Michael stared, completely dumbfounded. Alive and well? What kind of question is that? He was perfectly fine. A little slow, as I said, but he gave me the check. He's always been eccentric, a bit particular about his lawn, but he's lucid. What are you implying, Mrs. Albright? Are you saying this check isn't real? His voice had risen, the confusion and frustration finally breaking through his attempts at politeness. Because if there's a problem with the check, then just tell me. I'll go talk to him. But don't sit there looking at me like I've committed a crime for trying to cash a check that he gave me. His indignation, however justified, seemed to further distress Mrs. Albright. She flinched, as if he had physically struck her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her chest rising and falling visibly. She pulled her hand from the check, then slowly, deliberately, pushed it towards him, not turning it right side up. "Look at the amount again, Mr. Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with an undeniable tremor. "Look very closely at the amount." Michael squinted at the check. The numbers were clear, neatly written in Mr. Henderson's slightly shaky, old-fashioned script. $55.00, he reiterated, a growing sense of surrealism washing over him. "That's what it says. FIFTYFIVE. It's what we agreed on for the work." He even pointed to the written words, then to the numerical entry. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But Mrs. Albright's eyes, fixed on the check, conveyed a vastly different reality. There was a profound, almost cosmic sorrow in their depths now, mixed with the lingering traces of fear. She reached out, her hand hovering over the check, and then, with a delicate, almost reverent touch, traced a line just above the numerical amount, beneath the date. "And do you see this, Mr. Michael?" she murmured, her voice now dangerously soft, almost a lullaby of dread. "This very faint, almost invisible mark? It's a date. And the date, it's from almost 30 years ago. And the amount," she continued, her finger now resting squarely on the numerical value, "while it appears to be $55, has been meticulously altered. It's not $55, Mr. Michael. It's a sum far, far greater. So great, in fact, that it could only have been written by someone who no longer has any need for money at all." Michael stared at the check, then at her, then back at the check, his mind reeling. 30 years ago? Altered? A sum far greater? His head began to spin. He leaned closer, scrutinizing the pale blue paper, the neat script that had seemed so straightforward. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, just as Mrs. Albright had said, he saw it. A ghostly impression of an earlier date pressed into the paper, partially obscured by the current one. And below the bold 55.00, a faint, almost erased shadow, a faint line of ink where a different number, a much longer, more complex string of digits, might once have stood. The 55 now seemed to sit precariously over an older, fainter imprint, a layer of deception hidden in plain sight. The small check, meant to be a simple transaction, a fleeting moment of relief in a life of relentless struggle, had suddenly become a puzzle box, a relic of a hidden past, a gateway to an unimaginable secret. The silence in the office was no longer just heavy, it was suffocating. Michael's earlier worries about groceries and bills seemed insignificant, swallowed whole by the overwhelming, bewildering magnitude of this new, terrifying revelation. He still needed the money, desperately, but now the means to obtain it had plunged him into an abyss of questions, a chilling uncertainty that promised far more than just a momentary delay at the bank. He felt a cold dread begin to coil in his stomach. The small check, far from offering him salvation, was now an anchor, dragging him relentlessly into uncharted, dangerous waters. His gaze remained fixed on the manager, her face a mask of profound, unspoken knowledge, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his simple errand had just become the most complicated and potentially perilous moment of his life. The silence in the opulent office of Mrs. Albright was no longer just heavy. It had become an impenetrable, suffocating blanket, pressing down on John with the weight of unspoken truths and escalating dread. Mrs. Albright, still as a statue, stared intently at the small slip of paper in her hand, her gaze unfocused, distant, as if peering into a chasm only she could perceive. The check, which had begun this surreal encounter, was now merely a prop in a drama John couldn't begin to decipher. He tried to speak again, a tentative cough escaping his throat, but the sound seemed to shatter the fragile quiet, causing Mrs. Albright to flinch, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her rigid frame. Her eyes, when they finally flickered up to meet his, held a depth of emotion John had never expected to see in a professional setting. There was bewilderment, certainly, but also a profound, almost dizzying sense of awe, tinged with something akin to sadness, or perhaps even regret. It was the look of someone who had just witnessed a miracle, or perhaps a catastrophe, and was struggling to process the implications. John's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped within its cage. Was this check, this seemingly innocuous piece of paper, a fraud? Had he unwittingly stumbled into some elaborate scam? The thought sent a cold dread through him, a stark reminder of his precarious financial tightrope. He couldn't afford a mistake now, not with Lily depending solely on him. Finally, with a visible effort, Mrs. Albright lowered the check to her polished desk, her hand trembling slightly as she did so. Her breath came out in a slow, controlled exhale, as if she had been holding it for an eternity. Her lips parted, and John leaned forward, desperate for a sound, any sound, to break the unbearable tension. "Mr. Dawson," she began, her voice a fragile whisper, barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. It was a stark contrast to her earlier confident, almost clinical tone. This is quite extraordinary." John could only nod, his own throat too tight for words. Extraordinary, he thought. What could possibly be extraordinary about a check for a few $100s? Had the sender somehow overdrawn their account? Was it a joke? A cruel prank? Mrs. Albright's gaze drifted from the check to John's face, her expression softening, a hint of genuine sympathy entering her eyes. "The amount written on this check," she continued, her voice gaining a fractional strength, "is indeed correct. It states $500. A small sigh of relief escaped John. Okay, so it wasn't a fraud in that sense. $500 was still a significant help. But why the dramatic reaction? However, Mrs. Albright interjected, her voice now firming, imbued with a new, almost solemn authority. "The context of this particular check, Mr. Dawson, is anything but ordinary." She paused, her eyes sweeping over John's worn clothes, his anxious posture, the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. It was a look of deep understanding, almost as if she were seeing not just him, but the entire struggle of his life laid bare. She reached for her phone, a sleek silver device that seemed out of place amidst the old-world grandeur of her office. Her fingers, uncharacteristically slow, tapped out a number. John watched, bewildered, not as she brought the phone to her ear, her other hand resting on the check, as if guarding a precious secret. "Yes, Evelyn, it's Margaret Albright," she spoke into the receiver, her voice hushed, almost conspiratorial. "I have Mr. John Dawson here in my office." "Yes, that John Dawson." A brief silence followed, punctuated only by the faint, tinny sound of a voice on the other end. John's mind raced. Who was Evelyn? And why was his name being spoken with such gravity? "The check. It was presented just now. He's here to cash it." Another pause. "Yes, I understand. I've confirmed the details. I'm ready to proceed with the full disclosure." She glanced at John, a small knowing smile playing on her lips, a smile that seemed to hold the weight of destiny. "Please ensure all the necessary documentation is prepared. I'll be in touch shortly after I've spoken with him." She ended the call, placing the phone back down with deliberate care. The air in the room, previously heavy with silence, now thrummed with an electric anticipation. John felt a prickle of goosebumps on his arms. This was no longer about $500. This was about something much, much bigger. Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Albright began again, her voice clear and strong now. Please, sit down. She gestured to the plush leather chair opposite her desk. John, feeling his legs go a little weak, sank into its luxurious depths, the soft leather a stark contrast to the hard reality of his life. This check, she said, tapping it gently with a manicured finger, is issued from the estate of Eleanor Vance. Does that name mean anything to you? John frowned, raking his memory. Ah, Eleanor Vance. The name sparked a faint echo, a forgotten whisper from his childhood, but nothing concrete. I don't think so, Mrs. Albright. Not really. I mean, my grandmother had a cousin named Eleanor, but I never met her. She was always spoken of as the eccentric Aunt Eleanor who moved away decades ago. Mrs. Albright's smile widened, a genuine warm expression that erased the earlier tension from her face. Indeed, Eleanor Vance, your great-aunt, Mr. Dawson, and a woman of truly remarkable foresight and, dare I say, profound eccentricity, right to the very end. John felt a jolt. His great-aunt? The one who had vanished from family lore decades ago? What did she have to do with this check? Eleanor, you see, Mrs. Albright continued, leaning forward, her voice becoming a rich narrative, was a fiercely independent woman. She lived a long and incredibly successful life, far from the conventional path, but she never forgot her family. Or, more accurately, she never forgot the idea of family. She had no children of her own, and as her life drew to a close, she made a very specific, very unusual will. John listened, captivated, his own struggles temporarily forgotten in the face of this unfolding mystery. Her will stipulated that upon her passing, a trust would be established. This trust, Mrs. Albright gestured around her office, a silent acknowledgement of the bank's role, would be tasked with locating her closest living blood relative. And once that relative was identified, a small initial check, for a nominal amount, would be sent to them. The purpose of this check was twofold. First, to establish contact. And second, and most importantly, it was a test. A test? John's brow furrowed. What kind of test? Eleanor believed, Mrs. Albright explained, her eyes twinkling with a shared secret, that true character was often revealed not by grand gestures, but by everyday actions. She wanted her heir to be someone who was grounded, someone who understood the value of every dollar, no matter how small. So, the will stipulated that this initial check for $500 must be presented for cashing at one of our branches, specifically the main branch, where the trust is administered. If the beneficiary simply deposited it elsewhere or let it languish, they would not be deemed worthy of the larger inheritance. John felt a cold wave wash over him, quickly followed by a rush of heat. He had almost deposited it at the ATM. He had almost sent it through a mobile app. Then he had almost gone to his local branch. A series of seemingly insignificant choices, driven by his immediate need, had inadvertently led him to this exact moment, to this specific office. Fate, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of humor. You, Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Albright said, her voice filled with a quiet triumph, were the last identified direct descendant of Eleanor Vance, and by coming here, by presenting this check directly to a teller, and ultimately, by my recognizing the unique identifying markers on this specific check from the Vance Trust, you have fulfilled the conditions of her will. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing John to absorb their incredible weight. The small check, the one he had held so casually, the one he had worried about cashing, was not merely $500, it was a key, a test, a gate to an entirely new existence. And what does that mean, Mrs. Albright? John stammered, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable. A tremor ran through him, a seismic shift in his reality. Mrs. Albright took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she delivered the revelation that would irrevocably alter the course of John Dawson's life. It means, Mr. Dawson, that you are the sole beneficiary of the Eleanor Vance Trust, and the total value of that trust, after all taxes and legal fees have been settled, is precisely $87,642,112.37. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. $87 million. The number hung in the air, vast and shimmering, an almost unbearable weight of zeros. John felt a dizzying rush, a sudden, so overwhelming wave of nausea. His vision blurred, and the plush office, Mrs. Albright's benevolent face, the check lying innocently on the desk, all seemed to recede into a distant, hazy dream. He wasn't sure if he made a sound, a gasp, or a choked sob, but he felt the hot sting of tears prickling at his eyes. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years, not since Lily's mother left, not since the debts began to mount, not since the relentless grind of single parenthood had worn him down to the bone. They were tears of pure, unadulterated shock, of disbelief, of an almost unbearable, ecstatic relief. Lily. Her name echoed in his mind, a beacon of light cutting through the fog of his emotions. Lily. No more worrying about rent, no more scraping together change for groceries, no more turning down school trips or new toys. Hey, no more second-guessing every single purchase. Her future, once a source of constant, gnawing anxiety, now stretched out before him, vast and bright, unburdened by the crushing weight of poverty. Education, health care, opportunities beyond anything he could have ever dreamed of providing her. It was all real. It was all hers, through him. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. 87 million? He whispered, the words sounding alien on his tongue. It was an abstract concept, a number so far removed from his daily reality that it felt like a fantastical tale. Mrs. Albright nodded, her expression now serene, almost maternal. Indeed, Mr. Dawson, a truly substantial sum. Eleanor Vance was a shrewd investor, and her trust was managed with exceptional care over many decades. John closed his eyes, some pressing the heels of his hands against them, trying to ground himself. This couldn't be happening. This was the stuff of movies, of lottery dreams, not the reality of a struggling single dad who just wanted to cash a $500 check to keep his electricity on. I understand this is a lot to take in, Mrs. Albright's gentle voice broke through his swirling thoughts. It's a life-altering event. And please know, Mr. Dawson, that our bank is here to guide you through every step of this process. We have a team of dedicated wealth management specialists, financial advisors, and estate planners who will work with you to ensure this incredible gift is managed wisely, responsibly, and in a way that truly benefits you and your daughter for generations to come. She spoke of responsible management, of generations of wealth, words that had previously held no relevance to his life, now suddenly defined his future. The fear, the gnawing, pervasive fear that had been his constant companion, was not just gone. It had been obliterated, replaced by an expansive, breathtaking sense of freedom. He opened his eyes, meeting Mrs. Albright's gaze. There were still tears, blurring his vision, but now they were accompanied by a hesitant, trembling smile. Lily, he managed to choke out, his voice thick with emotion. My daughter, Lily. She won't have to worry about anything ever again. Mrs. Albright returned his smile, a genuine warmth radiating from her. No, Mr. Dawson, she certainly will not. Eleanor Vance, in her unique way, has ensured that. The small check, the one he had clutched so tightly on his journey to the bank, the one that had caused Mrs. Albright to freeze, now lay on the desk, a silent, unassuming herald of unimaginable fortune. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a testament to fate's unpredictable turns, to the quiet power of perseverance, and to the enduring, if eccentric love of a long-lost relative. John Dawson had walked into the bank, seeking $500, and walked out with a future he could never have dared to dream of. A future where Lily's laughter would be unburdened by his financial anxieties, a future shimmering with possibility, all unlocked by a check that was anything but small. What would you do if a seemingly insignificant check turned out to be the hidden key to a fortune beyond your wildest imagination? Share your thoughts on how such a sudden, life-altering event might change you, your priorities, and your relationships.